Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah. Welcome to another installment of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston. Please subscribe to the show on the YouTube. I've been busy posting some video shorts there where I am sharing some brief thoughts or rants of the day, and you can't get those videos on the podcast. You have to go to YouTube. And I love the videos that are getting lots of dislikes because then I know deep down that's hitting a nerve with a lot of the soft, gullible, and fragile MAGA Republicans out there. Hey, the truth hurts at times. And I do love that my subscriptions on YouTube are also going up as well. I mean, that's the best way that you can try to help this little project. And that's just simply by subscribing to the show on YouTube. And in addition to those videos that I'm posting, you can also hear all kinds of past episodes along with the Monday musings and the Friday shorts. And of course, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. Just like with YouTube, subscriptions help immensely. Also, they help spread the word of this podcast, which highlights the progressive movement inside the state of Michigan. It's a movement that is stronger than ever right now, and it's one that's actually willing to fight back against this fascist billionaire tech bro takeover that we are witnessing happening in our country right now. And while it's happening, MAGA Republicans on both the national stage and in Michigan are aiding and abetting this tech bro oligarchical white Christian nationalist cabal. For years, they argued about getting Big Brother and big government out of our lives, but they are just going to sit back and let a racist billionaire from South Africa gain access to search through everyone's personal data, circumventing the Constitution of the United States of America. Is that what people voted for? I don't remember seeing that on bumper stickers. I used to say that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney ran the most corrupt presidency in my lifetime, but they never allowed an unelected foreigner access to all of our government records or allowed him to close down parts of our government while ensuring to direct more and more public money to him. Progressive writer Oliver Willis talked about this Musk-Trump regime, and let me just read this one paragraph from his Oliver Willis Explains Substack, and I quote, "The conservative ideology of Musk and Trump, and it had been the dominant school of thought within the right for decades, these two are just worse at dressing it up than George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, believes in hurting the vulnerable while increasing the wealth and power of an elite few. Their mindset believes that nobody is of primary importance to the world than extremely wealthy, straight, white men, and that everyone else must bow to them and lick their, well, I'll just say boots. You cannot negotiate or engage in good faith discussions with people like this. They have to be ousted. They do have to be ousted, but unfortunately, we failed to win the last election because we chose to run MAGA Light. I remember when I invited Jared Yates Sexton from the Muckrake Political Podcast on the show last summer, and he tried to warn all of us about the power that these tech bro billionaires wielded and the dangers they posed if they got dear leader Trump and their personal boy wonder J.D. Vance elected. Listen.
That bro culture that you have brought up, that is another leg of the authoritarian stool. It involves religion, but it also involves patriarchal control. And quite frankly, these people are so soft. And, you know, you talk about Michigan, I talk about Indiana. The people that I have known who portray this hypermasculinity, they're so soft and brittle, and that's the reason that they do it. And J.D. Vance is playing a character in order to push his agenda, which is expressly anti-liberal, post-liberal authoritarianism. They believe that democracy was a mistake. They trace all of their ideas back to a pre-Enlightenment period, and all of the other stuff are just vehicles and costumes and rhetorical appeals. Everything that actually matters to these people is just profit and power.
Yeah, I think Jared nailed that one, don't you think? He said these tech bros believe democracy is a mistake and their ultimate drive is greed and power. And they'll use the white Christian nationalist part of MAGA Republicanism to their advantage as well. I mean, of course, they believe in that wacko ideology or belief system, so-called, but they're too busy trying to gain more and more power, because in order to ascend to such power, they need to divide the people just enough to cement said power. And they need good foot soldiers, like we saw in Congress this week when MAGA Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace from South Carolina shouted this during a congressional oversight hearing. Listen.
And tranny. I don't really care. You want penises in women's bathrooms, and I'm not going to have it.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Disgusting, of course, but let this be a lesson to many of you out there who believe that it was best to just kind of shove our friends in the trans community out in the cold last election. As we're seeing, the attacks on the trans community didn't just stop there. No. Musk and Dear Leader and all of MAGA have declared a war on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs inside the government, and are also attacking the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission by firing staff. And now the EEOC says it won't focus on anti-trans discrimination. The EEOC, by the way, was established when the civil rights law was passed in 1964, and it investigates different forms of discrimination. Hey, but that could be all gone if Musk, Dear Leader, and MAGA Republicans, with the help of the white Christian nationalist movement, continue to get their way without any real pushback from the corporate press or from the leadership of the Democratic Party. We are witnessing a coup, everyone, in real time, and that's something many of you, including you, Jon Stewart, said we really shouldn't have been saying the whole time. I remember hearing people say during the election, oh, don't be saying that. Nobody's really believing it. But it's what's happening. It's happening right now as a band of rich, unelected elites are ransacking throughout our government's classified records and personal banking records. As Dahlia Withwick and Mark Joseph Stern wrote in Slate this week, what we are witnessing is an unconstitutional seizure of power unfolding so rapidly that by design, the public and media cannot keep up. Musk, who spent nearly $300 million to get Trump elected, is now attempting to restructure the government around his own whims, vendettas, and obsessions. He is, in effect, serving as co-president. And as journalist and good friend of the show, Jennifer Schulze, said in her Indistinct Chatter Substack this week, journalists should keep reminding us that no one voted for Elon Musk. Yes. Many wondered if this were at all possible during the election, and many of us were saying, yes, it was all possible. And let me just say real quick, this whole notion that there are old Republicans and MAGA Republicans and that they are like different entities, I always thought that was wrong. And I said that over and over again here. Reagan Republicanism, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney Republicanism, backed by billionaire financiers and a well-funded media propaganda wing, led to what is MAGA Republicanism. This was predicted and foreseen by many, and it's why some of us beg Democrats to not only play the democracy is on the line kind of game, but also to point out how this new age rich robber baron tech bro oligarch class had nobody's interest in mind but their own. You think they cared about inflation, better wages, better working conditions, stronger unions, better childcare? No. They only cared about power and greed, and they used MAGA to get it. And that's why I didn't understand why the Kamala Harris campaign stopped attacking corporate greedflation and stopped putting our arms around strong, working-class, populist ideas. And that's why I also failed to understand the concept of Michigan Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer saying that she'd love to reach common ground with Elon Musk and Dear Leader Trump. What? I mean, that's why I don't understand what Michigan Democratic Senators Alyssa Slotkin and Gary Peters are doing right now. Rather than approving a number of Dear Leader's atrocious cabinet nominees, perhaps Slotkin and Peters should have been gaming out a strategy to protect their state against this coup. I have to say, though, that while the Democratic leadership on a multitude of levels has let us down so far, it was great seeing all of the news reports of a great crowd protesting in front of the Michigan State Capitol building on Wednesday. From the news reports and social media accounts that I followed, some Democratic Party office holders were in attendance this time, including friends of the show, Progressive Democrats Kerry Rongans of Ann Arbor, and Lori Pahutsky of Livonia. It was a peaceful rally because that's what real progressivism is all about, unlike the January 6th insurrection where MAGA Republican rioters injured 140 police officers. Oh, and speaking of Senators Peters and Slotkin, they were not in attendance, and maybe that's because they were in Washington, but couldn't they have at least sent a video to show their solidarity with those who oppose this right-wing billionaire coup happening inside our government right now? The people are angry, and I'm glad that at least some Michigan Democrats are hearing their calls. There should be more of them, though, because, of course, during the rally, the Detroit News reported that disgraced MAGA Republican clown State Representative Matt Maddock of Milford walked through the crowd, obviously trying to instigate something. I mean, no one bit on his antics, thankfully. Maddox said that he needed to stand up to left-wing fascism. I mean, shocking that this idiot doesn't understand fascism since he's the one enabling it. And by the way, it took people like Matt Maddox to allow Hitler to get into power, just saying. He's the same guy, by the way. Don't forget this. He's the same guy who last year posted pictures of supposed illegal immigrants being flown in by Governor Whitmer. They were landing at Metro Airport. But, of course, it turned out to be the Gonzaga men's basketball team. Yeah, you can laugh at it in a way, but you know what? It really was not funny because, you see, some of those players, they were people of color, and well, they have to be dangerous, according to Matt Maddock. Milford, you could have had a strong, working-class representative in Sarah Mae Seward representing you, but instead you chose this clownish MAGA Republican Matt Maddock. He's not going to help you, but he does want to do one thing. He wants to erase American history. You know, the history of, let's say, immigrants, or the history of the LGBTQ plus community, the history of African Americans, and the history of how this nation's wrongs led to some of the systemic economic and social hardships for many of our marginalized friends in this country. One of those history lessons that I know Matt Maddock would love to have disappear is the Milliken v. Bradley case, in which the Supreme Court, on a split vote, ruled that Detroit's suburbs could not be held responsible for segregated schools in both Detroit and the majority white suburban schools. This case, everyone, dealt a severe blow to the Brown v. Board of Education decision about 15 years prior, and it ensured that kids, many kids, would continue to be segregated by race in Michigan schools and schools across the country. There's a new book out about the history of this case, how it came about, how it divided Michigan and the nation, and how the ramifications of this case are still being dealt with today as we try to tackle inequality and justice. University of Michigan constitutional law professor Michelle Adams has written a book called The Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North. She's my guest on this week's episode of Left of Lansing, and I'll be back with her in just a moment.
A podcast that believes in using common sense to move Michigan into the future. And by common sense, we mean progressive sense. We've all seen what 40 years of Republican leadership did to this state, and we refuse to go back. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. You can follow Pat on Facebook or X, Pat still calls it Twitter, or on the Gram, Threads, and also on YouTube. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. All right, I think we gave Pat enough time to catch his breath. Let's get back to it. Here's Pat Johnston.
Also, don't forget to follow me on Blue Sky, since now I'm doing the majority of my commentary there. So just look up Left of Lansing there. And also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on YouTube. Well, I just talked for a bit about what's happening currently in the United States, and more specifically how it's hitting Michigan. But now let's go back and relearn a little history, because when we study the past, we hope to learn from our experiences and to never make those same mistakes of the past again. But again, we can also understand exactly what's happening today. And I have to tell you, though, I'm not real optimistic that we are really learning much from our past. And that is why it is vital that we have people like my next guest in the mix to remind all of us how the past remains as relevant as ever here in the present, and especially in the future. Michelle Adams is a professor of law at the University of Michigan. Her focus is on constitutional law, and she's got a new book that has just been published called The Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North. I'm beyond thrilled to have such an esteemed and respected legal scholar in mind here on this little podcast. So, Professor Adams, thanks so much for taking a little time out of your valuable and packed schedule to appear here this week. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Well, before we delve into your book, you are a born and raised Detroiter, right?
I am.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Palmer Woods, right close to the 8 Mile line, just over the border from Ferndale. I grew up going to the State Fair when the State Fair used to be across Woodward Avenue. That's where I lived for the majority of my life till I went to college.
So I assume then your experience growing up in Detroit played a major influence into why you wanted to write this book and how Detroit came to play in the epicenter of the school desegregation movement in the late 1960s and early 70s, correct?
Oh, I think that's right. I think it's a combination of reasons for me. I mean, it's such a rich subject to study. And being a Detroiter and being from here, I always had special feelings for Detroit, and I wanted to find out more. And then as a constitutional law professor, I would always be teaching this case called Milliken versus Bradley. And I could never really communicate to my students why that case was so important. And there really wasn't a book out there that sort of told the story and all the richness and the detail that I realized that it had. And so I just kept reading and reading and reading and found out there was a great story there. But yes, in terms of being from Detroit, I left here when I was 18 and didn't come back until a couple of years ago to work at the University of Michigan Law School, but it's always been in my blood. And I care deeply about the city and I care deeply about education.
How long did it take you to write this book, or at least maybe just consider? A long time?
A long time. Over 10 years. And the reason was because I started thinking about it and I started reading, and I'd never written a book before, and I'd never done archival research before, and I'd never interviewed folks before. And so some of the skills that are on display in the book, I had to teach myself. And then what I really was trying to do after I got the first draft of the book, it was fine, but I really wanted to work out a manuscript that was able to be accessible for everyone. And one of the things I really pride myself in here at the law school and have, teaching law students for so many years is being able to translate what is relatively complicated legal doctrine into the kind of language that folks can understand while not dumbing it down. And I wanted to use that skill of translation in the book. And it took a while to kind of hone that skill. And so what I really wanted to deliver was a book that was going to be accessible to everyone who's interested in nonfiction, everyone who's interested in history, everyone who's interested in civil rights, as well as scholars and law students and undergrads as well. And so that was my ambition, was to hit that fine line.
So you touched on this already, but, when I was in school, we learned, or at least, got a brief overview of Brown v. Board of Education, which obviously said that students couldn't be segregated by race. However, there really wasn't a mention of Milliken v. Bradley, in which the Supreme Court essentially answered the question who is responsible for desegregating schools. So, Professor Adams, can you give us an overview of how the Brown case led to the battle to desegregation in Detroit?
Let me take you back to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which is a case that everybody's familiar with. And in that case, it was a landmark case decided by a unanimous Supreme Court, held that state-mandated segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And this is a big deal because this is the first time the court's really doing that in a major public accommodation. The public schools is where we come together as Americans to learn together and to try to sort of work out notions of citizenship and democracy. And the court mentioned that. And so that was really important. The thing of it was, though, is that Brown really was about sort of southern states and border states, all of which mandated segregation by law. And there's a fancy term called de jure, but what that really means is by law. And so Brown said it's illegal to segregate students by law. And then in 55, there's a follow-up case to Brown called Brown 2. You got to desegregate with all deliberate speed, which is an oxymoron. And then the court kind of left the field until 1968 and didn't speak again really on how do you actually desegregate until, a long time later. And it was still in 68, we get another case, and it's a case out of Virginia. So the bottom line is that while everybody knows that the court said that segregation in the South was unconstitutional, the question becomes, well, does Brown apply in the North? Does Brown apply in Detroit? Does Brown apply in Los Angeles? Does Brown apply in Chicago? Does Brown apply in Boston and things like that? And there's a lot of misconceptions about what was going on in the North and West and whether, in fact, we even had state-mandated segregation here. And so Milliken versus Bradley is really the case that I argue in the book brings the Brown era to a close. But even more importantly, it turns out that case, and I can talk more in detail about it, but the case ended up being about the story of Northern Jim Crow, right? So we think about Southern Jim Crow and we think about whites only water fountains, and we have these kind of visions and images in our minds. But when we think about the North, we don't really have a vision or an image. And so what happened downtown Detroit every day in Judge Stephen Roth's courtroom for 41 days is a trial that really sort of exposed Northern Jim Crow. And so that's what made me feel like I was going in the right direction when I kept reading and kept looking and realized that there was an incredible story there.
Thanks for bringing it up, because I was going to ask you about Northern Jim Crow. Are there differences? Is there some type of differentiation between Southern Jim Crow compared to what you would... go ahead.
As I said, the Southern variant is what we're used to. The way that I would explain it is that we had a nationwide policy of governmentally supported and mandated segregation, both in schools and in housing and in a variety of other places. But that policy appeared in different guises in different regions, right? So we know what it looked like in the South. We know what it looked like in Little Rock, right? We know what it looked like in Mississippi. It looked different in Detroit, and there were different techniques that were used to maintain it. And in fact, in Michigan, there was a state law that prohibited race discrimination in the public schools, but it was traceable to governmental action all the same. And that's the key part that I think folks need to focus on. There's a name that's floating around out there, and it's called de facto segregation. And you often will hear this term de facto. And what it really means is we don't know what caused it. The schools are racially identifiable. Certain neighborhoods are racially identifiable. We don't know why. And what they showed in Judge Roth's courtroom was that there was a reason why, and the reason was governmental action by a wide variety of governmental actors. And so, yes, I'm here to report and sad to say that we did have a nationwide system of Jim Crow, but it looked different in the North, and it took a lot of digging to sort of expose what it was.
Your book is called The Containment. Could you just take a moment to explain that term and how it goes back to housing segregation, since it coincides with segregations of our schools, right?
Sure, I can. But, in order for listeners to be able to understand that, let me just give a little bit of background on the trial, because the phrase the containment really comes out of the trial. And I think listeners need to understand what trial are we talking about, where did it take place, and all that kind of good stuff.
Sure.
Overview, long story short, the NAACP Detroit branch sues state and local school authorities in 1970 here in the state of Michigan. And what they say in their lawsuit is that the school authorities, city and state, had intentionally been segregating Black children into Black schools in Detroit and white children into white schools. And the theory of that case was that intentional segregation violated the rule in Brown. The reason that was a difficult case to bring was related to what I told you a little bit earlier, was that the Supreme Court at that time really hadn't spoken about what were the standards in the North. Did Brown even apply in the North? So it was a complicated legal question for the lawyers. And so there had been some lower court cases, and those cases where there had been other sort of Black families who were suing, and they were saying, our schools are segregated. One of the things that the governmental defendants did in these other cases and other places was say, we're just requiring that students go to school in their neighborhoods. That's not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. That's not a violation of the Constitution. It's just a neighborhood school rule. It's racially neutral. There's no segregation there. There's no race discrimination there. And so one of the things they knew that they needed to do was kind of strip the bark off of that idea of neutrality and to explain and to prove that, in fact, the neighborhoods themselves were intentionally racially segregated. And that when the school authorities decided to have a neighborhood school rule, or school authorities decided to site a brand new school, and of course, in the 60s and 70s, they're building a lot of new schools, directly in the center of a Black neighborhood or directly in the center of a white neighborhood, with the forethought that it would be occupied and would be attended only by Black children or white children, that they were incorporating the underlying residential segregation directly into the schools. They did a bunch of other stuff too. So now this is a long-winded way of trying to answer your question, what's the containment? So we go into the court, and plaintiffs' lawyers got a big job. They got to show that all of this segregation is related to governmental action. Well, how do they do that? They want to show housing, and they want to show what's happening in Detroit. And so what they did was they put on a housing case in the middle of a school case. So imagine that your defendants are the school authorities, and you're going to have like a 40-day trial or 41-day trial, but you're going to have 10 days that are going to be about housing. Right? Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to draw the connection between intentional residential segregation and intentional school segregation. And so you've got this big housing case. And in the housing case, what they show, or their concept or their guiding light, is the containment. It's about how Black folks in Detroit can't live where they want to live intentionally. Right. And so there's census data that they put up, and they have some exhibits, and the judge is looking at them, and they're looking at, you've got this clump of sort of Black folks in the center of the city in the 1940, and then it breaks out a little bit more into 50, 1960, a little bit more, 1970, a little bit more, gets to the jurisdictional boundaries of Detroit. But then they explain the mechanisms that created that. And so they say there's this containment that contains African Americans in these particular areas. Well, what caused it? Well, you got redlining, right? You've got the actions of federal authorities. You've got the Homeowners Loan Corporation and their security maps. And so it's not really possible to get federal mortgage loans or to get federal mortgage guarantees in predominantly Black areas because they're considered to be hazardous, right? So the federal government won't back loans there. It systematically disadvantages Black communities. There's even a segregation wall, which I wasn't aware of when I grew up, that was almost within walking distance of my home, that a white developer had to put up in order to get the federal backing to separate where he was going to build new homes for white folks from the Black area that was located there. You've got racially restrictive covenants, even though those are the things that run with the land and say you can't sell your house to African Americans or Jewish folks or whatever. And even though the Supreme Court outlawed those in 1948, they continue to be reported in mortgages through a local title company up through 1968, 1969, right? You've got the reliance on racially restrictive covenants by the federal government. You've got intentionally segregated public housing, which is very sticky. You've got two racially separate housing salespersons in brokers associations. So there's Black brokers and white realtors, and the white realtors operate almost as a cartel, and they won't share any of their listings with Black brokers. So Black folks who want to buy houses outside of Black neighborhoods don't find out about them. Is there state action there? Well, yeah, because there's at least state endorsement of the separate organizations, and they had to have a code of ethics, and the code of ethics is the one that basically was race-based. And so there's the school siting determinations. There's all these different things that they're showing in the housing case. And what's really interesting about this is that while I love Detroit and it's very special, it's not unique. All of these techniques were basically the same kind of greatest hits techniques that were used across the country to intentionally segregate Black folks into Black neighborhoods. And then the school authorities just sort of layer on top. And then they engage in intentional racial discrimination too. And so that's why it's called the containment, because they kept sort of making this argument with this phrase, the containment, and it really converted a judge who was incredibly skeptical of the case, federal district court judge, who's like, NAACP, get out of my courtroom. And then by the end of the trial, he's like, yeah, I think we really need to have a really bold Brown required remedy here.
Well, Professor Adams, can you talk more about that judge? And his name is Stephen Roth. And, how he was able to change his mind from where he was originally thinking?
One of the things you asked me earlier about the book is sort of, how did I write it? Why did it take so long? And the answer is, I really wanted to write a character-driven narrative story. And so the judge is one of the characters, one of many fascinating characters in my book. And he's a guy, Hungarian immigrant, sails to the United States in steerage, grows up in Flint, works his way through undergrad, law school. He's part of the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, former prosecutor, not the kind of guy that you'd say is a flaming liberal. Put it that way.
Yeah.
He doesn't have that kind of background. Quite skeptical of the plaintiff's case when they get in there. Is like, what are you guys talking about? People live where they want to live because they want to live around people of their own kind. Everybody knows that. And he changes. And I think one of the things that's really important to focus on, particularly in this moment, is how do you change minds and why it's so important to keep an open mind. And he does. He's got an inclination, and his inclination is, I don't think the plaintiffs have a case. But over time, the plaintiffs put on an incredible case. First, that housing part that I told you about. And then, of course, they then get into the specific things the school authorities did. And by the end of the case, he's convinced, he understands how Northern Jim Crow was cultivated, maintained, perpetrated, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really a story about the importance of facts and about how facts can change minds, and how having an opportunity to really sit with something and think it through and be able to ask questions and engage as one would hope we would engage in a well-functioning democracy can bring people to a different place, even if they start out somewhere that's very, very different. And so he's a character, but there are many, many more.
He's like an interesting character study in himself, right?
Yes.
In many ways, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so then we get Judge Roth's decision. It is upheld in appellate courts, and then it reaches the Supreme Court, where it is knocked down by a 5-4 vote. Can you talk about the process and how it got to the Supreme Court, and how then President Richard Nixon's judicial picks played a key role in reversing Judge Roth's decisions?
Happy to do that. So now we need to do just a tiny bit of constitutional law for your listeners. So we think about a legal case. And really, in these big kind of public cases like this, there's really two questions. The first question is, did the government violate the Constitution? And lawyers often call that the liability phase. Is there constitutional liability, right? Was there a Brown violation? Was there intentional government conduct intended to segregate the schools and separate the students by race? Yes. Court answers yes. Every court where that was an issue answered yes. Supreme Court never overturned that ruling. The question that the Supreme Court had to deal with was, well, once you've established that there's liability, that there's a constitutional violation, what's the remedy for that? And in the South, the remedy for that was desegregation, right? That was what the later sort of follow-on Brown cases said. If we desegregate the schools, that's the appropriate remedy. So, Roth is like, well, that should be the remedy in the North too. That should be the remedy here too. And the state of Michigan or responsible state officials have been found to have violated constitutional law. Plaintiffs won the case. And so he says, well, how do we have meaningful desegregation in the city of Detroit? And at that point, the school system in Detroit was majority Black and becoming more so. White folks had been leaving the city, and there was plenty of evidence that came in during the case showing that, in fact, the state had operated outside of Detroit lines and that the suburban school districts were being benefited by certain kinds of state action. But most importantly, that all the school districts in the state of Michigan were state agencies. So the actions of the Detroit school district was the action of the state of Michigan. So he said, let's have a metropolitan remedy. Let's pull in a good chunk of southeastern Michigan and have the students go to school together. And that was the issue in the front of the Supreme Court, not whether there had been a constitutional violation. Basically, that issue was out of the case by the time we get there. It's whether you could have a remedy that crossed school district lines. That was the question that the Supreme Court had to deal with. And that was the case that was decided 5-4, and they overturned Judge Roth's order. In fact, his order never went into effect. It was always sort of what lawyers would call stayed on the way up on appeal. But there was a panel that he had appointed that came back with some really interesting suggestions for how one might attempt to desegregate the schools in southeastern Michigan. But the key thing is it would have affected about 800,000 students in around 50 or so suburban school districts along with the city of Detroit. It's sort of mind-boggling to think about that now and basically get to the Supreme Court. Supreme say, now, it's all over here. Unless you can show that the individual school districts themselves actually violated the Constitution, created some sort of segregation in the city of Detroit, can't bring them into the remedy. They're off limits.
Well, and I think that is the most frustrating part maybe of the whole story is that the courts recognize that there was indeed a problem, but then ultimately the Supreme Court said, I don't know if there's really a fix for it, though. It's kind of depressing.
I think it's depressing. I think there's no question about that, although I think one of the arguments I make in the book is that it doesn't mean that everything's over. I do think that it was an extraordinary moment, an extraordinary opportunity to pivot and try to create a different kind of world than the one that we currently inhabit. It was hard. 5-4, 4 of the 5 in the majority that struck Judge Roth's order down were Nixon appointees, which is what you'd asked before. One of the things that we're well aware of now is that it's incredibly important to win elections, right? And I think that, it sounds really kind of simple to say, but one thing that I think we haven't repeated enough times and we can't repeat enough times is when you go into the voting booth to cast your vote for president, you're casting your vote for the Supreme Court. Sometimes it's hard to focus on that because there's so many different things and so many immediate problems that voters are facing. But the president, largely, the president is the one who gets the appointment power, and it's with advice and consent of the Senate. And if the Senate is the same party as the president can basically put who they want on the Supreme Court, and then they're there for life. So the power to change the membership of the Supreme Court is largely how constitutional law changes. Constitutional law doesn't change because we amend the Constitution very much. We don't do that very often. Constitutional law changes because we change the judges. And we need to remember as voters that if there's certain things we really want, we have to think about that when we go into our voting booth and cast our vote. But this situation, I think with Milliken versus Bradley, it's a tragedy, and I treat it as that because I think it was an opportunity. But I also think that in thinking about this moment, we pivot to the idea of what's important in a democracy. And I think the story that I tell is about the importance of democracy in 3 ways. So there's what I call small d democracy, which is one of the untold stories in the book is about how Black parents in the North were protesting and boycotting in very large numbers in the early and mid 60s in the North to get their schools desegregated, which is not something that's necessarily widely known. So political activism is small d democracy. Big D democracy is electoral politics, which is what I just said, the importance of casting your vote and winning elections. And you got to win the election of 68, and then you got to win the election of 72. Doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. But then finally, the question of democratic socialization and what we need to have a well-functioning democracy. And I think that that's what I want to focus on. I want to get my readers to focus on too. Like, what would it take? What would it really take to try to have a multiracial democracy with 340 million people? That's a hard thing. It's a really, really, really hard thing. What would it take? I think one of the things that I argue that's sort of implicit in the book is I think it takes having our children educated together from the earliest grades under conditions of equality. Thurgood Marshall, in his dissent in the Milliken case, said it best. He said, if our students aren't going to learn together, it's hard to imagine they're going to be able to live together. There's democracy running through this book in many, many kinds of ways. But I do think that it's worth taking a step back and looking at history and thinking about what do we really want from education? How do we want our democracy to function, particularly in this moment?
Then that will lead to my final question. At the beginning of the show, I talked about all of these attacks that are happening in our current political environment, attacks on the notions of diversity and equality, so much so that whenever there's a tragic accident, like the plane crash in D.C., the reflexive response from the current presidential administration is to blame diversity or blame equality or blame inclusion. Even if they don't even have any evidence yet, that's what they tend to do. It's just what their reflexive blame will go towards is DEI and all of that stuff. Would you say that those kinds of feelings and those kinds of attacks on diversity are the result, or at least the byproduct, of the Milliken decision?
Well, I don't want to overclaim, and I don't want to say that this is, X equals Y. What I want to suggest instead is to say, when we think about democracy and when we think about the democracy project and about holding on to a republic and holding on to a democracy, do we imagine that we can have a really well-functioning democracy in a situation where we are segregated? Whether back in the 70s, easily traceable to governmental action, do we think that separateness is the way to create the preconditions for us to be able to come together and nonviolently settle our differences and be able to work out our conflicts through the procedural mechanisms of a Republican form of government? And I suggest that I think that becomes a very, very difficult and a very tall order. And so one of the things we might want to look at when we think about what's going on today and how can we make things better is to try to go back to first principles of trying to get our schools more racially integrated. And I think that that's a question that we need to ask in terms of sort of what's on the table. My book, in large part, is written to stimulate demand, right? On the demand side of the equation in terms of what do parents want? Because there's a lot of techniques that we could use that we could sort of throw out to say, well, this would be better. We can try, rezoning and all these other kinds of things. But if every time you try to propose a technique that would lead to racially deconcentrating the schools from a socioeconomic perspective now too, if the response is no, 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 then they're not going to go anywhere. So what I'm trying to do is stimulate demand and say, what do we want our children to get out of an education? What does it mean to get a good education? What does it mean to be able to get an education to be able to function in a work environment? Put aside democracy with folks who have very different experiences and worldviews. How do you educate a student to do that? So that's really what I want to focus on, and I'll leave to others, including elected officials, to deal with the situation we find ourselves in now. But what I offer the reader is to take a journey back with me and look at this incredible narrative approach and think about this story and think about the possibilities. And then I'm asking the reader, or I'm inviting the reader to draw their own conclusions.
All right. University of Michigan constitutional law professor Michelle Adams, author of The Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North. I'll make sure to provide links so listeners can pick up a copy of your book. And I thank you once again for so much of your time. And if possible, I'd love to have you back on the show again.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's progressivism with passion. It's the Left of Lansing podcast, where Pat shines a light on Michigan's progressive movement. Contact Pat at leftoflansing@gmail.com.
Again, I'll provide links to where you can get a copy of Professor Michelle Adams' book wherever you're listening to the show, and of course, also on the Left of Lansing YouTube page. And you heard Michelle Adams sound like not all hope is lost, but we have to start winning elections because, as we're seeing today, losing has consequences. But I do want to make one more note here, and that is the importance of the Supreme Court. I have never completely understood why Democrats, at least to me, don't do a better job at highlighting the importance of the Supreme Court. I feel like they did after Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, but the importance of winning the courts sort of went away in 24. Yeah, it was brought up here and there, but it wasn't really a focus point. And that's especially after story after story was released about the corruption within the court and how big money oligarchs were giving conservative justices lavish vacations, meals, housing, and all kinds of things for other family members. That should have been another point hammered home day in and day out, the corruption of the Supreme Court. Always run against the corruption, and then the people will listen. It just feels like that was another major opportunity missed in 24, and we're going to pay for it. Time now for the left of Lansing last call. What many of us knew would happen if dear leader Trump won the White House is happening next to Elon Musk. The person who maybe gave the Trump campaign the most cash in the election was Miriam Adelson, the widow of former casino billionaire Sheldon Adelson. The Times of Israel reported last fall that she shelled out some $100 million to a campaign committee backing Trump. But we can't tax the rich more money because that would have meant Miriam Adelson could have only given $90 million, maybe? Anyway, we know the Adelson family has never backed a two-state solution to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's why Trump proudly announced with the corrupt war criminal and right-wing leader in Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, in the White House this week that the United States would take over Gaza, remove all of its Palestinian inhabitants who've been bombed endlessly, and then hopefully turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. He's, of course, echoing the same sentiment that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who mused last summer about how insanely valuable waterfront property in Gaza could be. I mean, come on, a little ethnic cleansing to satisfy some massive greed out there. I mean, that's awesome, right? Dear Leader Trump said he'd like to move the remaining Palestinians who've survived over a year and a half of Israeli bombs. He'd like to move them to Jordan or Egypt. That made University of Michigan Middle East history professor Juan Cole write the following on his informed comment page, and I quote, "In his first term, Trump reversed decades of U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East almost overnight. Now, after the Trump press conference, it seems that the ultra-conservative oligarch administration that seems to lean on Christian Zionism is intent to go far further despite the likely cost and lethal consequences." Now, Dear Leader's people said later on that he wasn't really calling for a complete ethnic cleansing, but that he'd like to temporarily move the Palestinian people to another area. But Trump also committed to putting American boots on the ground in Gaza, which again is something I don't remember him campaigning on. Now his people say he didn't really mean that. Bibi sure had a wry smile on his face, did he not, though, during Dear Leader's statements? So Dear Leader's words, of course, have sparked outrage amongst the Arab American community in Michigan. The Detroit Free Press describes how a Palestinian American group in Westland said a military takeover of Gaza would be a costly mistake reminiscent of the invasion of Iraq and would further drive instability in the region. Yes, it would. I agree. Dearborn Mayor Abdullah Hammoud said deploying U.S. troops and using taxpayer dollars to invade Gaza is morally indefensible. Our commitment to justice remains unshaken no matter who sits in the White House. And that's where I would like to take just a quick moment and tell many Democrats and liberals to please chill out for a second, because his friend of the podcast, Amanda Mazur of Northwest Michigan for Reproductive Freedom, said on social media, if your response to Trump's plan to complete the ethnic cleansing and take control of Gaza is some offhanded comment about Dearborn, you are a disgusting person. I believe Ms. Mazur is responding to posts like this one from writer and activist Julie Rodzinski, who wrote, "Heck of a job, Dearborn, especially you, Rashida Tlaib." Now, I'm not trying just to single out Ms. Rodzinski. There were many, many other tweets in that same kind of tone. So she was not the only one, but I'm just using hers as an example, because that's not the way to go on this, people. Many Palestinian Americans, many Arab Americans were against how the Biden-Harris administration supplied the right-wing Bibi Netanyahu government with all the cash and weapons he wanted so that way his government could slaughter innocent women and children. Many Palestinian Americans live in Southeast Michigan, like Dearborn, and probably knew loved ones or at least had acquaintances who lost loved ones due to the homicidal killings in Gaza. It's not that hard to understand and be empathetic over. They looked towards Biden and Harris, who represented the once anti-war Democratic Party, a party who's supposed to stand up for the least fortunate, and they were left feeling betrayed, angry, and lied to. Michigan Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who keeps getting reelected easily and who AIPAC did not even touch because she's too popular within her Detroit district, is a Palestinian American. She obviously was not going to be a fan of what's going on there. And that's why thousands, including yours truly, voted uncommitted in the presidential primary last year. I was also against the Biden-Harris team's gross mishandling of trusting in Bibi as he slaughtered thousands and thousands with our money, with our weapons. How could I be pleased about that? How could you be pleased about that? That being said, as I tried to warn, however, this problem of handing Israel's right-wing government whatever it wants is not a Democratic Party problem. It is a two-party problem. Yes, Trump was always going to use some of the animosity that Arab American voters had for Biden and Harris, and he used it to his advantage. But once he got back into the White House, as I thought, he would do even more to appease those in Israel who want us to help them finish the job. And that's why all Kamala Harris and the Democrats had to do was announce the funding spigot for Bibi's killing rampage would stop on her watch. Then maybe she wouldn't have lost Dearborn like she did. That's the lesson I learned from all of this. There were so many steps Democrats could have taken, the correct steps, the moral steps, but they didn't take them. Be mad all that you want at those who backed Trump over Gaza, but you should be even madder at Democrats who were too afraid to do and say the right thing. Now, in the idea of fairness, for those who backed Jill Stein, where is she? No, I'm serious. Where is she? She seems to find cameras up to the point of Election Day, and then, to quote Hall Notes, she's gone. Where'd she go? Why am I not seeing her protesting our government being overrun by a billionaire tech bro? Or why am I not seeing her protesting that dear leader called for a complete removal of the Palestinian people in Gaza? Where is she? Why is she not giving interview after interview? Oh, right. Jill Stein won't pop up again until 2028.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wander Beats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
That's going to do it for this edition of The Left of Lansing. You can always email me, leftoflansing@gmail.com. Don't forget to follow me on Blue Sky since, again, I'm doing the majority of my commentary there. But again, if you'd like to always just kind of have more of a one-on-one conversation, the best way to do it is leftoflansing@gmail.com. As I said, subscriptions really matter. So please subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to your podcast and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Special thanks again to Michelle Adams for being on this week to talk about her new book and to echo some similar things that Professor Adams said. We have to be engaged if we're going to keep this whole democratic experiment alive and well. We're seeing that with the groundswell of grassroots anger and fight that we saw during the anti-fascist pro-democracy protest at the Michigan State Capitol and other state capitals this week. And like I said, it was really nice seeing some good, strong, progressive Michigan Democrats join the rally this time. Hopefully, progressives will continue to show the way to do what again? Oh yeah, that's right. Take the battle to them. Until next week, thank you, Michigan.
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.